Welcome everybody. My name is Paul Turner, and today I'm going to talk to you about some concepts in health and healing that may help you to come back to a nice, balanced, healthy, positive, responsive state instead of a reactive and negative one. So I've titled the talk, How to Stay at Peace in the Present Moment, Choosing Response instead of Reaction. In order to sort of get back to a nice healthy state, I'm going to go through a number of concepts. I'm going to talk a little bit about, first of all, what does health mean in terms of time and space? What is health? What is disease? That'll help because it gives you a little bit of an idea of how to recognize imbalance when it's presenting itself. We'll then look a little bit about how healing works in terms of time, more specifically, about how quite often when we're in stresses of life, we're not actually in the present moment. We're not looking at things from the now and seeing things as they are. How we see things is often colored a little bit by our past experiences and the traumas we may have had in the past, which affect our present situation, or alternatively, we may be distracted by worries and anxieties about the future. We will probably need to define or talk a little bit about what a reaction and a response is, at least the way I'm going to define it. And we're going to probably need to look a little bit about reaction, neutral, response, and release, those concepts and how they work in healing. After we've discussed all this, I'll share a little practical exercise with you and perhaps some examples of how to get yourself back into a nice, present, balanced, responsible state when things are out of balance. And that'll bring us to the little diagram at the bottom right corner of the slide. Now, I've talked about some of these ideas in previous presentations. The stuff on health and disease I have in another video, and I've also talked about time and forms in the time and forms section of an online course that I made up, self-healing course about how to manifest your healthy self, a journey in self-healing. So there's some resources there if you're interested in following them up. The reason I've got all this information on one slide is because I'm trying to tie together a few concepts. As I talk it through, if you find the wording a little bit much, just look at the pictures. I'll talk through all the concepts. I've just put in the wording there, sort of little summary points of everything I'll be talking about, things or key points for you to remember. So let's go into it. So let's start with the concept of health and healing on the top left aspect of the slide. So this is quite a simple way of putting it all, but if you think of health as, let's say, a perfect circle and everything is even, if you look at how you might define health, if you're looking at someone who's healthy, you would use probably words like ease, function, and balance. You know, the things are at ease, they're functioning, they're balanced, they have a sense of well-being. If you look at the relationships between different components of that whole person, such as between two tissues, or between the mind and the emotions, or between the spirit and the mind, the emotions, the energies and the body, it doesn't really matter, but any two elements of the self, if you look at the relationships between any two elements, they'll be in harmony. They're one, there's a unity, there isn't any difference in terms of function. They get along, they work together, they're understanding one another, everyone is looked after. So you could sort of say that a healthy state is one where every element within yourself is healthy, and your, in terms of relationships between elements within ourself, and also your relationships between yourself and others and the environment and nature is also healthy. Everyone is in a nice, healthy, unified state. I call that a win-win situation. One way to know if you have ideas or you want to do something in life that you think, or even talking, that might be helpful, or you're talking to people, you can always ask yourself, is this healthy for me? Is it healthy for the other person? Is it healthy for the whole? If it ticks those three boxes, it's probably a healthy concept, which is useful. It doesn't cause any harm to others, and it's something you can go ahead with and feel pretty safe that it's going to work out for you, or at least you can give it a go and see what happens. Now, disease, on the other hand, this is just a way of defining very simply disease. So instead of a nice even sphere or circle where everything is one color, if you like, I've drawn a little ovoid patch on it. So now you have a state where there's a difference. Okay, there is, let's say, a dysfunction, an imbalance, and a dis-ease. So if you look at the language or the wording, instead of ease you have dis-ease, instead of function you have dysfunction, instead of balance you have imbalance. So the clue to it is really in the language. So in the healing arts, so I'm in the osteopathic field, so, or in the manual therapy fields, or even any healing field, if you're looking at, say, someone's posture, in order to recognize dysfunction, it'll have all three of what is called ART. Okay, these are the clues in the body that tell you that something is going on that's perhaps out of synchronicity with the whole picture. So A is asymmetry, R is range and quality of movement, and the quality is more important because that reflects function. Range just tells you that something is limited but not why. So the range really doesn't matter, it's too much, it's the quality. Quality indicates function. So it's either functioning in harmony with other areas or it's not. And T is tissue texture change. So the tissues might be tense, or they might be feeling unhealthy, or they feel flat or drained or whatever. I've gone through that in other slides, so you can look at that in more detail somewhere else. But you're looking at all three of those things, A, R, and T. The quality of the movement or the function is impaired in some way. You can have areas within the body that are a little bit asymmetrical and maybe have altered texture, but they may actually be functioning well in themselves, which is the same in society in relationships between people. So for example, if I had you standing up in front of me and I pushed you over so that you're a little bit asymmetrical, then you are, if you look at your posture, the posture will be asymmetrical. Now the muscles and the tissues are going to tighten up to stabilize that posture. Okay, so there is texture change or tension. So you have A and T. But if I ask the question, are you functioning? You would have to say, yes, I am, because if I wasn't functioning, I would fall over. So that's really important because that gives you the idea that you could have two of these components but not three. If you've only got asymmetry and texture change, how you know if that's a treatable problem is if it's actually functioning or not. Okay, so just because someone's a little bit crooked or out of position doesn't mean they're not functioning. They could be compensating for something else. In this case, if I'm pushing you over, I am the cause of your asymmetry and texture change. But when you look at relationship, it's the relationship between you and me that's in trouble, not the relationship between things happening within your own body. So in other words, you're doing the best you can in the circumstances. The only reason you're asymmetrical is because I'm pushing you over. I hope that makes sense. So the key element when you're looking at disease is that relationship between components. Any components of the whole are no longer in unity. They're separate or they're different. Now this could be important in healing because if there's something going on within our own system, so within our own being, we have our spirit, we have our mind, we have our emotions, we have our energies, we have our body, we have all the different organ systems. We've got all these different components that make up our whole person. Now if the problem is ours to a certain extent, then when you look at the relationship between any two elements within our own system, and they show imbalances in symmetry, texture, and motion, then you know there's a problem that could be resolved within ourselves. Now, having resolved that, you'll bring your whole system back into balance. In other words, you'll bring yourself back into a sense of health, ease, function, and balance within yourself. And how you know that is because when you look within, everything sort of feels good and it's all working together. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're in a healthy state of relationship with someone else. So if you have something outside of yourself, your interaction with another person, let's say a relationship with a partner, or a family member or someone at work, if something is out of balance, it could be like the example I gave. It could be that one element of that relationship, one person, could be pushing the other person over, or bullying or harassing or causing problems, so to speak, and that you may be functioning okay if you're coping well, but you're having to adapt to that issue. So in that sense, the relationship imbalance would be between you and the other person or the other situation. If it's affecting you, that means you're allowing someone else to push you off your balance, and that creates dysfunction eventually within your own system, because after a while, initially your system might be coping with that pressure or that stress, but after a while it'll get fatigued and tired and start to wear down. And then eventually it might manifest as a dysfunction within your system. In other words, it's got to the point where it's broken down, it can't cope anymore, and then there is a dysfunction within itself. So healing in that sense has two different elements. If you heal yourself and get yourself back to function again, that's getting you back to coping again. So in other words, you might get yourself back to balance, but I'm still pushing you over. The issue is your relationship. So when you start to own your power and stand up tall and recognize where the real issue is in your relationship with perhaps something else, you can stay in your power and not allow yourself to take on other people's projections or other people's stresses, which means you may have to verbalize that, you may have to do something constructively to remedy that situation. Now that is an issue in itself and probably the topic of another discussion. But for now, I'm trying to give you a sense of how health and dysfunction works in terms of within ourselves and in our relationship with the external environment. Because unless the real cause is dealt with, then what could happen is that we're constantly compensating for stresses placed upon us elsewhere. And if we're allowing that to happen, we are technically taking on board other people's stresses, other programming, other people's issues that we're owning ourselves. So healing has to start somewhere. So the first point of call would be getting yourself back into balance, so you're operating from a stable base. You bring yourself to neutral. You bring yourself to a point where you can see things clearly, and then you can start exploring your relationships externally with others and see perhaps if there's any external elements that are contributing to how you're feeling in the moment. Because once the cause is acknowledged and dealt with, you can start to heal. If you're just dealing with the effects, it's a bit like mowing the lawn over and over without pulling the weeds out. So once we clearly see where the original cause is, we can do something about it. Otherwise, we're sometimes a victim. We're playing this victim-victimizer game. Okay, and I have talked about that elsewhere as well. So that gives you an idea. So you've got this relationship element. So in the case where I would be pushing you over, as soon as you realize that, you could say, could you please stop moving me, pushing you over? Or you could probably remove yourself from that situation if I'm unwilling to bend. Or maybe I'll have to be restrained. There could be a whole number of possible solutions. The important thing is seeing where the real issue is in order to start working out how you can resolve it in a way which is beneficial to yourself and the others, which gets back to our definition of a win-win situation. Healthy relationships within ourselves, standing in our power and providing a stable base to form, and then overflow that to create healthy situations with other people. And that doesn't mean taking on board other people's stresses. You want to at least stay in neutral or do something constructive about it. At the very minimum, not be reactive to the pressures placed upon us from others or external sources, and instead choose to respond constructively. And sometimes that whole situation, as we become more conscious, can be ways we can start to learn how to refine our senses, become more present, and start to really understand all these multitude of factors which may impact on our health and our living conditions. So there's health and disease. So in health, everything is one. In disease, relationships are no longer in harmony. There's a dysfunctional relationship. And that is the clue that something is imbalanced. How do we know there's a problem? We have to use our consciousness, use our awareness to tune in, to tap in and get tuition from within. We ask the questions and we start to notice our relationships, first within ourselves and then with others. As we start to do that, you get better at this whole process and healing starts to get more meaningful, deeper, and more successful because the causes are being dealt with and not just the effects. So that's the health and healing concept. That's the first thing to be clear on. The second element to be aware of is time. So time this is the picture sort of on the left bottom corner here. Time has a few elements that we traditionally think about. So there's the past, the present, and the future. So when we talk about being in the present moment, another way of saying that is you're in the eternal now. The present moment is being right here, right now. In a sense, if you're in the moment, it's a timeless state. It's a state where past and present and future are all simultaneously present in the now. So from a more spiritual angle, they all exist simultaneously. We're just experiencing it in our own individual journeys in terms of a past, a present, and a future. Now, that is, again, a topic for another discussion. For now, just sort of think about the idea. So the eternal now is a concept that represents a consciousness and awareness of past, present, and future simultaneous, which means that you're not distracted by the past or the future, but you can look at the past and the lessons and things you've learned from it and bring the meaning that you've derived, the positive lessons that you've learned, into the present moment so that they color your present experience. The past sort of sets up the present, and the present will set up the future. In the present, if you are making sure that your system is healthy and you're actually choosing to respond to life constructively and form healthy relationships with others, then you are putting healthy energy into the world. And then as that goes out, that'll set up a healthier future, because the past dictates the present dictates the future. They're like seeds, they're karmic seeds, if you like. And I've talked about that in other videos as well. But for now, you can sort of see that this topic can get there's a lot of different elements to sort of pull apart and explore. At a basic level, we want to be present, we want to be in the moment. The reason that's important, because if you're aware of you're in the moment and you're in what's called a neutral state. So I've got this picture here that says it's a negative, a neutral, and a positive. They're the three sort of elements. There's always light and dark and a balance. There's sort of negative, positive, and a balance. There's future and past, and then there's the balance point. There's, what else have we got? Spirit and matter, and then there's the balance point. So there's always sort of the three elements in manifestation at once. Life in manifestation expresses in a rhythm, in a motion, which links up to that definition of health in terms of flow and healthy relationships. So I've drawn it as a seesaw here. There's a seesaw, and you can think of time and space as like the positive and negative poles. Negative in the sense that you've been passed through it, and positive is stuff that may be in the future, but they're all existing simultaneously. The balance point, the left side of the diagram, the right side of the diagram. And as long as they're swinging in harmony, there's a rhythm and a motion, and everything is breathing and flowing. Okay, so if you're in the now, you're in the present moment, it gives you context, it's synthetic, it sees the whole, it's staying in the moment. For example, if you're in the present and you're in a neutral state, you can choose to optimize any experiences you have now and gain the most positive growth out of it. You can choose to respond in a positive, constructive way to a situation, and which means you are responding to it. You're able to respond from a balanced position, or you can choose to react in a negative, destructive way to that same experience. In other words, you will get a positive meaning or a negative meaning from it by how you choose to respond or react. So that's getting us into the definition of response versus reaction. I see response as a constructive response to a situation. Now, that's easy when the situation is a healthy, balanced one, but it's a little bit more difficult if you're in a challenging situation where all the players in that interaction aren't coming from a balanced place in themselves. If someone is coming from an imbalanced place within themselves, and they're coming from a reactive or a victimizer consciousness where they're trying to get what they want at the expense of others, that is a win-lose situation, then that becomes a difficult and challenging situation. Now, we may not be able to do anything about how the other person experiences their reality, but we can choose to respond to that situation constructively as opposed to further making it worse by being reactive to it. So getting back to that example of, say, me pushing you over and your body then getting pushed out of balance but still functioning, then once you're aware of that, you know I'm pushing you over, you can choose to respond to that system, that event, constructively instead of destructively. And there may be a number of things you can do to help remedy that situation, which we can go into another time. But at least you're aware of it. You can choose to, at the very minimum, not take in more dysfunction. You can stay neutral and constructive. Okay, so that's called a response. Or you can choose to react negatively, which further increases the imbalance. So you're seeing how we're using the concepts of health and disease and this sort of concept of interrelationship with others in a positive and a negative sense and a balanced sense. So neutral would be staying in balance, but aware of the factors involved in that relationship. Negative would be reacting destructively, which is going to further damage yourself and others. So you have a win-lose situation, which is actually a lose-lose situation, because the win-lose is from the perspective of the selfish person trying to get what they want. They're judging it according to getting what they want, so they think it's a win. But ultimately it's a loss because they only hurt themselves in the long term. If you are playing the victim, you will take on that stress. So for example, if I were to say to you, you're a useless human being, that's a faulty belief. That's a projection. That's not true. You're worthy to be here by the fact that you're present here in this world. If you take that on, then you are taking on a negative belief and you're believing it that's true, which means it's going to create dysfunction because you're taking on something that isn't actually real. Okay, that's your responsibility. Once you realize that isn't true, you can bring yourself back to balance and neutral, which means saying, hang on, I am a healthy, constructive human being. I'm meant to be here and I'm here for a reason. Now, when you own that power, that other person who's projecting it on you can't get away with it anymore. Okay, like looking in a mirror, they're finding someone isn't taking on board their projection, which means it'll bounce back on them all the quicker and they'll have to deal with it. Okay, because they're not getting away with it. So this is important because it's going to get back to the healing concept that I'm going to talk to you a bit about a little bit later. So that's one example. So you're looking at these interrelationships. So reaction is a negative, let's say a negative way of dealing with a situation. A response is dealing with it in a positive, constructive way. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to be able to change the outcome in some cases, because sometimes you can stand firm, you can present your case, and the other person may not choose to listen to that. That's their choice. But at least you've presented it, and at least you haven't taken on any negativity. So going up to the top of the diagram here, you can see how it all gets, the more you talk about it, the more factors become present, so it can get a little overwhelming. So I'll stop here, let you digest that a little bit, and we're going to go up to the top of the diagram instead and look at time in terms of a succession of moments. So if you think of time as a succession of moments, in other words, you're in the present moment. If you're in the present moment and it's balanced and it's healthy and it's functioning and it's in synchronicity, if you move into the next moment, you will still be in a synchronicity balanced state. And then the next moment, and then the next moment. So if you think of this little circle here, so there's a diagram here that's got a big circle and a little circle inside it, saying past negative beliefs or attachment. And then there's a little circle on the outside of the bigger circle that says future or negative beliefs or attachments. So let's look at the big circle for a minute. Let's look at the big circle as representing your life path, or our life path. If we come into our incarnation and we travel through life staying in the present moment, staying conscious, staying aware, and then just traveling like you would a little raft on a river. Okay, you're traveling along the river, you're going along about your business, you're staying in your moment, you're enjoying the scenery. Okay, if you could stay in that boat, in that moment, centered as you negotiate life's challenges, It's like going down the river. You come across a few obstacles, you'll stay in your boat, you'll get through the obstacle, you'll come out the other side wiser, and you continue on moment to moment to moment. You get through your life path, full cycle, and come through, we'll say, relatively unscathed, hopefully wiser for the experience, learning a few lessons along the way. In other words, each challenge that you have, each encounter, such as rapids on the river, you'll encounter each of them and you'll learn and work out ways of negotiating through that challenge, which is not avoiding them, it's going through them and coming out the other side still in your boat. That would be staying in a situation, coming out the other side wiser and learning from it and optimizing your experience, okay, not reacting to it, and so on and so forth until you complete the life cycle. Now, what often happens, however, as you're traveling along your life path, let's say you come to a life event or an encounter. Let's say it's a traumatic one or a relationship conflict of some sort. That might throw you off your balance if you get caught up in it, if you get distracted or abducted from your moment into something else. Now, that something else can be a worry about the future, or it could be a dwelling on something from the past. So let's just try and keep it simple for the moment. Let's say you're going along your path and you're having a nice little time and you think, oh, but I'm worried about my finances, or I'm worried about this situation that's come out. Your thoughts start to go from being in the moment and present, okay? Now remember, going back to the present, if you're really present, you'll be aware of future and past as well as the present moment in terms of that 3 elements of time. If you're on the river, you're aware of what's ahead of you, you're aware of what's behind you, and you're aware of where you are at the same time. Life will give you a certain viewpoint where you can see a certain distance ahead and a certain distance behind. So if you're traveling along and you're in that present moment, you're not just obliviously in your boat, you're actually sitting in it, and you're looking ahead and you're looking behind, and that way you can see things coming to you before they get to you. Okay, so you're prepared. If you look into the past, you can actually learn from the experiences of the past that give you ammunition to handle present situations. That would be staying present. When you get stuck, when you get distracted, however, if you're just oblivious in your boat, or you then get worried about the future, it's a little bit like the mind sort of jumps from the big circle here, let's say, to a future worry. Let's say you're worried about something. So you're actually jumping to 2 things. You're jumping to whatever's worrying you, which may be a fear that something might happen, or an anxiety about something, or it might be about something in the future that may never happen. So without you even realizing it, you've actually gone out of the present moment and you've jumped to a whole nother idea, a whole nother reality, you could say. And now you're actually over here on this right circle, you're stuck in a future worry. Okay, so when you lose the moment and get distracted by the belief or the attachment to the new idea or concept, we can get lost in it. And then we go, oh, now I felt great a moment ago, and now I'm feeling anxious and stressed and whatever. That doesn't mean that the peaceful moment has disappeared. It's still there. It's just that we're no longer in that reality. We're in this other reality, you could say. And then you think, oh, if only I could go back to feeling great a moment ago. But the problem is, when you start to go from your present moment of feeling anxious, because that's what's occupying your presence, anxiousness has been allowed to come in, or you've been allowed to be abducted by it, such that you're in the quicksand, so to speak, of that worry. And then what happens is you think, if you try and go back to being in a nice healthy moment, you're actually going back into the past, which actually is technically, by definition, is losing that moment again. So that's not how you get back into balance. So let's say you're stuck on this future belief system, future worry, to the point where it's distracted you from the healthy picture on the left, the big circle. Now, this happens the same. I'll talk about scenario 2 in a minute. Let's say it's a future worry. The way you get back into balance is you sort of say to yourself, all right, I'm now in an anxiety, a worry. think of it as a circle, like a little bubble that you've suddenly got sucked into. Now, at the same time as that, you sort of think about, let's say, the ideal timeline or the healthy timeline as another bubble, right? So you actually visualize two bubbles, which is this little picture at the bottom. You've got this health, which is now smaller because the bubble of disease has grabbed your attention more. Then what you do is you ask yourself, how much of my, you find that sort of neutral point, that balance point where it's almost like you're walking along a path and you've been distracted by something and you've wandered off into the woods, and then when you realize you wandered off, you can't find your healthy path again. So you notice where you're at. You don't ignore it. Don't try and run away from it. You just say, I'm feeling, let's say, anxious. All right. Then what you do is you think about health as an ideal, like two bubbles standing next to each other, except now the problem is bigger than the dysfunction, the health. It's tricky to talk about, but I'm going to do 2 or 3 examples of this so that you sort of can see how it works in different scenarios. Okay. So then you sort of find the balance point where both concepts are present. You think about the disease, you think about the health, and then you think about the point of relationship in between, the balance point. So it'd be like you draw a little line between the two bubbles. So imagine there's 2 thought forms, 2 realities, and then you ask yourself, how much of my consciousness, how much of my attention is being drawn into the worry and the anxiety? Let's say it's 70% or 80%, which is like the diagram on the bottom. And then say, well, how much of my attention or consciousness is still aware of or present with a nice healthy state, the bigger circle. So it might be 80% of your attention is getting diverted to the problem, and 20% of the awareness is still present with the health. Now, 100% of you can't be in the problem because you would be so dysfunctional you wouldn't be present, okay, at all. So there has to be at least still 1% of your consciousness plugged into health, whether it's realizing it or not. Then what you do is you just sit in the balance point between the two. You imagine both are present at the same time. So think of it like, a farmer that's got sheep in a pen, and they're sort of at the gates, and they're opening the gate, and the sheep are going into, let's say, a healthy pen, and other sheep are going to the unhealthy pen. So it's like the thought forms, sheep are like thought forms here, and you're allowing the gates to be open so that they're all getting diverted into the negative thought form instead. As soon as you realize that some of your consciousness is being diverted, some of the sheep are escaping, some of your energy is getting leached out or escaping or diverted to the other pen, to the negative one, let's say, you're in a position where you're sort of coming back to neutral. So neutral is bringing yourself back to a state where you can see that you're getting drawn into this negative reality. And you can detach from it to a point where you're aware of it and it's still there, but you're also aware that on the other side of the gate is a healthier option. So you're in a position where you can choose. Then what you do is you gradually just sort of shut the gate, if you like, to the negative pen, and instead of your energy being siphoned off or getting deflected to the negative thought form, you just allow it to gradually come back to the positive thought form, because you're bringing them both into the eternal now, into the present moment. You're not trying to sort of jump from one reality to another and back and forth and then getting all confused. You're holding an awareness of both at the same time. So it's like the shepherd, separating the sheep into 2 pens. You're in control of the gate, so you can steer where your energy goes. You're gradually taking that energy back and opening the gate to the healthy side so that your energy starts to fill that up, and it'll go from, say, 20% to 30% to 40% to 50% to 51%. When most of your attention is getting directed to feeding the healthier pattern, the negative pattern will start to recede. So the negative pattern on the other side will try every trick it can to get you to dwell on it. So the problem when it's starved, because you're starving the disease, you're starving the problem, you're not feeding the problem anymore, you're now just directing your energy to the health. When you stop directing your energy or attention, if you like, to the problem will start to try every trick it can. It'll throw tantrums, it'll feel worse, it'll start to react. But if you don't buy into it, it'll come to a point where it starts to run out of energy because it exists only because of the energy that you give it. So you are giving it energy. If you don't give it energy, eventually it starves. So after a while, you'll feel it go through all its little tantrums, like putting it in the corner and saying you're not allowed out till you get along. It'll throw its little tantrums. It'll start to settle down. It'll start to come to a neutral state, which means it's giving up trying to manipulate you anymore. And then you'll feel yourself sort of, if you like, plug back in to the healthier side. You're back in the present moment again. And it's just enough that it's almost like you only need 51% to be plugged back in, and to the point where you come to this sort of what's called a balance point, or another neutral point, where the problem is no longer dragging your attention anymore. And then you start to feel it all unify and come into balance again, and then you'll get a sense of relief. It's almost like the problem fades away, and what's left is more of your real self. You're back in the moment again. So it's like you find your path back to the where you're meant to be, and then you can continue in the moment along your life journey. And that's how it works. So let's say you're going along, you're back on track again, and then you get to a new life experience. And this time it triggers a past memory of an old situation, right? And that old situation, let's say you get in a loving relationship, and the old situation is maybe you have a bit of it didn't work so well, and you had a little bit of a breakup, and there's a lot of anger in that resolution of that relationship. So as you're traveling along, you might suddenly get distracted by a memory of the past. And that memory of the past distracts you again from your present moment. So you've done the same thing. You've gone from the now to then a memory of the past. And now you're reacting to the present. Almost like you bring that memory into the present. And you respond to that new relationship from the memory of the past, which means you're not actually seeing the new relationship or the person in it as who they actually are now. And that means you might react to them from a trauma of the past instead of a new situation where anything is possible. You can choose to explore that relationship in a much more, like a child experiencing a whole new event, unimpeded by the dictates of the past. So you do the same sort of thing. As soon as you realize that you're actually, this is where time comes in, because you're now drawn out of a situation in space, in the present, and without realizing it, you're actually gone back into the past, and you're living out the past again in the present, because it's all part of the now. So when you realize you're doing that, you'll feel inside yourself you're getting drawn into an old past trauma pattern, which may be stored in your tissues. As soon as you recognize that, you surround it. So you're surrounded in love and health. So like going back to this picture of disease, if you alternate the disease or the pattern you're stuck in with the surrounding health, you make health bigger than the problem. You might be able to sort of bring yourself back to a neutral state where you can see that without being caught in it. And once you get to the neutral state, it's like you're suddenly out of the quicksand, on the edge of it again. You can see it's still there, but it hasn't resolved, but you're no longer getting dragged into it. You can draw a little line from that bubble of the past back to the bubble of the present. And you do the same thing. You sit at the gate and you notice how much of your attention is getting drawn into the past memory, and then how much of your attention is being aware of or present with the healthy moment. So that's the same process. Then you choose which one you want to feed your healthy life energies, and being careful not to allow your energies to be usurped or distracted or drawn into the past. You just wait very patiently for the negative attachment to sort of throw its tantrums and release, and the present moment starts to become more and more present until it gets to the point where you sort of feel like memory or the attachment to the past drops away and you're fully back in the present moment. So this sort of gets back into this concept of the reaction, the neutral, the response, and the release element that I mentioned earlier. So when you put, for example, let's say you put two people in the same room. Let's say one is healthy and one is diseased or in trouble. You say you're not allowed out till you get along. And you're not forcing them to get along, but you're just giving them time and space to sort out their differences. What will happen is the healthy pattern will always stay present. It'll always be happy. It'll always be in its power. It won't react negatively to anything thrown at it. It doesn't take on board any stresses. The problem pattern, or the part of the consciousness attached to the problem pattern, will be drawn into it. It'll throw tantrums when you start to withdraw your attention to it. It'll try every trick to get what it wants. It might attack you, it might ignore you, it might try to manipulate you, and when none of that works, eventually it gets so tired and frustrated, probably after getting angry. So that's why in healing sometimes people can often get a little bit angry for a while when their patterns are sort of going through the peak of their intensity and the ego is starting to lose control, the lower ego. Then it gets to a point where it starts to sort of get a bit tired, it gets fatigued, it starts to feel perhaps a bit down or depressed because it's not getting what it wants. So it goes through that almost process of death and dying. You know, you get denial, you can't deny it, so you start getting angry, it doesn't work. You try to bargain, it doesn't work, so eventually you get depressed, and then eventually you come to a neutral point. Neutral points where the problem sort of looks up and says, I've yelled at you, I've screamed at you, you're still happy. I want some of that. I'm not happy. I want some of that. How do you do it? And then it starts to be open to or receptive to allowing a healthier energy to start filling it back up again. And then it starts to blend back in with the health and become one, form a healthy relationship. So you get a unity, and then you get this sort of, finally, when the system's had as much change as it can handle, it'll release, and you'll get that rhythm of life. The breath of life kicks back in, telling you that all's as balanced as it can be for the moment. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not more to do. It just means that in this moment, in this present moment, you've come back into a nice balanced, synchronistic state where you can enjoy your life as it actually is without trying to make it be anything else, without getting drawn into the past or worried about the future. And then you can just get on with doing whatever excites you the most in life, whatever makes you feel fulfilled, and pursue your next life path until you get to what you might call the next challenge in life, where you then have an opportunity to respond to that situation and work through it and come out wiser, or react to it, deflect from it, and end up in a worse state. So once more, you're back on track and you're back in your healthy life rhythm and cycle again. Now I'll give you one more example. Let's say you're traveling along your life path once more, and you decide that you go to, let's say you go to a healing or meditation group, and let's say the instructor is saying to you, we're going to do a meditation on unconditional love, okay, on exploring unconditional love and what that means and what that feels like. Now this is let's say this is another experience in life, another encounter that you've come across. And so what I'm getting at here is that you can use this concept not just with getting drawn into the past or the future, but with anything that you do in life. So you need to remember that when you are meditating on something like unconditional love, let's say you have a group of people, you're doing a meditation on unconditional love, and most people are getting into it and feeling it quite well, and then there's this, let's say this person, say us, instead of feeling unconditional love, we start feeling this huge amount of anger again. So let's say that instead of feeling love, we feel angry. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that love doesn't exist? Does it mean that we don't believe in unconditional love? Or what exactly is happening in this process? Now, let's say they haven't fully healed their old relationship experience, okay, where they had loss or a negative experience when they think of love. It brings the anger up instead. So let's say there's still more to that issue. So they're meditating on unconditional love. They start feeling this anger. Because they feel it, they may start to think, well, okay, I don't believe in love. Instead, I believe in anger, right? So the fact that the anger comes up doesn't mean that the love doesn't exist. Just that this person has been distracted from it by being abducted by the anger reaction instead. So you've got to remember one thing here, that perfection brings imperfection to the surface and energy follows thought. So if something other than what is actually contemplated, in this case unconditional love, comes up, that something else must be what is actually in the way rather than the feeling of the object or thought or experience contemplated itself. So a good analogy here to remember is it's like if you think of healing, I often use the analogy with clients. I say, imagine your personality is like a bucket, the mind, emotions, and body. And in the bucket, there's a certain amount of healthy water and murky water, health and disease. Let's say a certain percentage of each. Now, modern medicine or symptomatic medicine might look at that bucket, take a sample and say you're chemically out of balance, and then they put another chemical in order to balance you in the imbalance. But that might make you feel better temporarily, but it's not actually clearing the issues out of the bucket. Okay, it's just helping you to compensate with what you've dealt with. It's making you feel temporarily better. Which is again like mowing the lawn without actually doing any weeding. Healing, or true healing, is where you actually pour more health into the bucket. So let's say you're pouring health into a bucket and it's 50% full of health already and 50% full of dysfunction or memories or traumas from the past. So as you start to pour energy in, clear energy into the bucket, it starts to interact in the bucket. It builds the percentage of health up and starts to flush the feelings or the trauma back up to the surface of the consciousness. So that's what's happening in this case. When you're meditating on something that's positive and something negative comes into the consciousness, what that is your body's way of telling you what you're actually letting go of. Okay? So in this case, it's telling you that anger is getting in the way of you being unconditionally loving. Now, because of perhaps the way we're educated in society, we sort of often think we shouldn't be feeling this way. I don't want to feel uncomfortable, or maybe I shouldn't be feeling uncomfortable, or maybe I shouldn't be seen to be uncomfortable. Society sort of programmed us in a way to react to this situation rather than responding to it. So in other words, we might try to suppress that feeling. We might try to push it back under, suppress it rather than express it. So when it comes up, if you remember that it's just coming up, you might go, all right, I'm meditating on unconditional love, anger's coming up. Thank you for telling me that there's anger in the way. So you do the same thing. You make a little thought formal bubble of anger, and you make another thought formal bubble of unconditional love. Instead of denying that love exists, and this is the funny thing about our egos, sometimes it's so traumatized by our past experience, it's so angry, and it's so traumatized and bitter and hurt that it thinks that is now the new reality and that love doesn't exist. So this is what we have to be careful of, because the ego will sort of say, it's basically like saying, I believe that anger exists and love doesn't. But let me put it to you this way. It comes up because it's the very thing that interferes with our being loving. Okay? Because we don't want to feed it, we often, if not present and neutral, project the anger back onto the person or situation triggering it, or we deflect it or suppress it, or otherwise try to avoid what makes us feel angry. We may even defend it by claiming that love does not exist and anger does, which, when you bring it into the light of consciousness and reason, is ridiculous when you think about it. You could ask yourself, is it not better to believe at least in the possibility of something loving, rather than always being in a state of angry? So which would you choose to believe is more real? Okay, do you want to believe that there's a possibility that something could be better and is better, or do you rather believe in the possibility that it never will be? So this is how we sabotage our healing and sabotage ourselves. Once we see that, we bring that awareness into the light of day, into the consciousness, we realize how ridiculous that belief system is, and then we can choose to come back to a neutral state and respond instead of react, and allow some of the connection to occur once again with the reality that love is still there. It's just obscured by the attachment to that belief. So we go back to that diagram again. We've got this problem that's so big in our consciousness, and there's this little glimmer of reality or truth that's still there. So you ask yourself, how much of my energy is getting deflected into the into the anger or the past memory. So we're sort of on anger again, and we're also onto or fear or whatever else it may be, and we're also lost the moment, we're back in the past. So you put them together in the dysfunction. You say, how much of my attention is in it? Let's say 80% in this situation again. And then you ask, how much of my energy still is one with and connected with the possibility of unconditional love? And it might be 20%, 80%, it might be 1%, 99% if the problem is really big. Okay. So then you, instead of choosing to react and believe and buy into the negative bubble, you sit at the gates, you sit at the door, you look at the situation until you come to a neutral place where you can see both. And even if you can't see the health, you know that it is there to some degree, even if it's 1 or 2%. Know that that possibility is there. Hold on to that little flicker of light. And then you're like sitting them on the scales. You know, you've got this little tiny little bit of your attention still believing or even hoping, or one with health, and the other one's so big that it's weighing the scales down unevenly. That seesaw that I drawed before. There's too much on the negative side and not as much on the positive side. Okay, you could say. So then you find the balance point. Where is the pivot point between those two patterns where you can be equally present to both? And it'll be in that interaction between the two. So you draw a little connecting, communicating line, and you surround them in the space. So that's what I say when I said the example of the two people in the same room. You're creating a space, a loving space. You're putting the two patterns in the space like two individuals, and you're letting them be present with each other until they learn to form a connection and then communicate. And then what you'll find will happen once you find that balance point is that the energy will start to come away from the sort of drain back from the problem and start to feed the health. And the problem, again, may throw its little tantrums. Like as you're healing that situation, you may feel anger, and then you may start to feel other feelings and thoughts all come up that are a part or entangled in that memory. And as they start to surface, you might feel anger and then fear and then hurt and then rejection and then all sorts of an unworthiness and whatever else it may be. It might go through a range of different shifts and changes and unraveling process. And as each one comes up, you just ask, what is the relationship between what I'm feeling and the health and the ideal? And if you sit in the balance, it's like the energy starts to come back into, it's almost like the attachment to the energy reattaches to the healthier pattern. The problem is sort of watched until it starts to fade back into the pattern. The two bubbles will come together. The lighter one will get brighter. The other one will start to detach. It'll come to neutral. It'll start to listen. It'll then start to respond. When you get into a responding phase, it doesn't mean it's healed. It just means there's a little, it's like two people in a counseling session. They finally see each other's point of view. They understand each other's story, and then they can choose to come back into a unified, balanced state where the separation and the dysfunction starts to let go, and a unification and an understanding and a balance comes back. So you'll get this response phase where you're building in a healthier pattern, because just getting to the point of neutral is where the problem is like saying, all right, I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to start to try and build in, or start to actually not even try, just start to accept and allow and build in health. And then it's like learning a new skill. It's like learning to ride a bike or play the piano or build in a little bit more love or learn to play tennis. You get practice at building in what you want. Because you're putting energy towards it, it starts to get stronger. You start to get better at it. It's like eating a meal, digesting it and building it in. It starts to become part of you, and you start to gradually train your system to build in more and more health. Now, in any one session or any one meditation or any one healing session, it'll get to a point where it's like the problem detaches, it lets go, it builds in a little bit of health, and then it releases, and you get this sort of rhythm and breath of life kicking back in, where they're both in unity. The rhythm is flowing, the seesaw is ebbing and flowing between the positive and the negative without being attached, and you're in a nice little balance point feeling a lot better about it. Now, once all you have to do is get back into the balance point. And in that balance point, the universe, the process will keep flowing. You're back into this sort of diagram of you're back on your ideal timeline. And as you move around a little bit further around your life experience, when you get to the next encounter and the next challenge along the river of life, you are now have learned how to handle all those preceding challenges. You've learned how to not be distracted by the anxiety and worries about the future. You've learned how to recognize and detach from the past. You've learned how to let go of negative stuff that comes up when you're thinking or meditating or trying to build in positive stuff. And that arms you. And as you sail along the river of life, each encounter you are stacking and adding more experience and more richness to your life experience. You're learning the lessons instead of getting dragged down by them, until eventually you arrive at the end point where you've had a fulfilling and, let's say, a life which has brought more wisdom, growth, and understanding, even if it's been a hard one. And the other thing is that when we create problems, when we react to problems, even healthy ones, like the trouble with the ego, let me put it this way: the true self, the soul, or the higher self, if you like, responds to situations, even negative ones, in a positive way. So it makes the most out of them. If you eat unhealthy food, for example, and there's only 3% nutrition in that unhealthy food, the health in the system will absorb that 3% and not take on board the other 97 and imagine it sort of passing and getting excreted or as waste. So, that might not be literally what happens with nutrition, but in conceptually that sort of makes some sense. If something has sort of 3% of health and goodness in it, you'll absorb it. If something has 90% health and goodness in it, you'll absorb obviously a lot more. And that way you don't make more problems for yourself in your life than you're actually meant to have. So you could say that you've set up on any particular river, there's 4 or 5 major life challenges that we have to negotiate. If you're a reactive type of person, you might find that you end up with 10 or 20 or 30 or more problems because we aren't learning the lessons that each of our set challenges is meant to give us. Okay, so we're making life a little bit harder for us than we need to be. If we're sitting in our boats and we're not paying any attention at all when we encounter our difficulties, if we're not learning how to think and reason and look ahead and learn from the past and bring it all into the present moment, then it's like sitting in a boat oblivious of the scenery. When you hit a rapid, you might get thrown in and fall out of your boat, because that's like a person who's just sailing through, hoping to get through without doing any work. The work is actually learning to be conscious, learning to be aware, learning to negotiate life's challenges and get the most, or optimize them to get the most out of them in a healthy way that is going to be good for us and for everybody and the environment. And then that way it's a win-win-win situation. So they're all different analogies or different ways of looking at it. But like with anything in life, like learning to play a sport, you get good at a little bit, you move up, you get better at it, you move to a higher grade, you learn to then you get more difficult challenges or more interesting challenges, or you're sort of like playing tennis at a higher level, and then you start to learn through those encounters to get even more perfect, or you get more growth and more understanding from those experiences. So it doesn't have to all be healed at once. It can heal in increments, but in each session, each time you do a little exercise like this, the minimum you want to be able to get to is come back to a point of neutral or balance, and then your system will release when it's had enough, and then you can just enjoy your journey. So it's going back to the river analogy. Once you've negotiated a challenge or a situation or an experience, and you're sitting on your boat on the other side, just going with the flow in the river, then you can just enjoy that journey. And then when it's time to get to meet your next challenge, you will arrive at that moment and you can apply the same principles to it. So it's a bit like you enjoy the flow when it's flowing, you do the work when it's working. If you can have a little bit of awareness of past, present, and future, you'll learn the lessons that that life has given us from our past, bring them into the present so we can use those skills to negotiate even more interesting challenges or experiences in the future. That way you're learning at every moment. If you have a little bit of foresight, you can see things coming before they get to you, and you may be able to negotiate the obstacle even better than you would had you not been aware of it to begin with. And that brings us to the end of our discussion. Hopefully that's given you plenty of interesting things to think about, and also a practical way of getting yourself back to balance when life is a bit tricky or you find yourself a little bit reactive. Best wishes, and until next time, see you later.